So I think this can help explain what happened after, 1940 roughly. So, so here what you see is I've plotted the population of DC along with its suburbs. So in blue is DC, and then red is Prince George's County, green is Montgomery County, purple is Fairfax County, and the sort of light bluish, kind of sky blue, is Arlington. So I think what's impressive about this is that this was not, so what happened during this time was not simply a movement away from industrial cities completely. So it was not a movement to the Sun Belt, right? I mean, this is a claim that people, moved from the Northeast to, areas in the Sun Belt, areas in the South. I mean, that does not explain really what happens here. It was not a movement from certain metro areas to others. It was a movement predominantly within metro areas. So there was some movement from the Northeast and the Rust Belt, these older industrial areas, to the South, and Southwest especially. But what is sort of more impressive is that people are just moving from urban areas. So from areas that were, had these features of the urban, that were dense, had a certain amount of population, had certain designs that produce urban behaviors and urban ways of relating to other people, to suburban areas. And and it happened pretty much just as, in the same fashion as the old industrial cities had gained population as well in, the period between 1850 to 1940. Just looking at this map this graph is sort of impressive. And what's also interesting is, which counties, so these are counties, did the best, were the most suburban ones. So Arlington is a suburb of DC, but it's a slightly urban one. So it's one that's closer in, it has more of a history of being more urban, and its population did not see this dramatic rise. It sort of, stayed stable. Slightly increased, didn't decrease like DC's, but did not see this dramatic rise like Montgomery, Prince George's, and Fairfax. And this can, partially be explained by its smaller size, but, what we're kind of seeing is that there's some sort of almost equilibrium size now, and it's not this very dense urban size. So we see the same thing in Baltimore. And so, Baltimore declined just after the 1940s, and its suburbs, Anne Arundel, Baltimore County, and Howard County rose dramatically in the same time period of its decline. And so you could do this with, most cities except for those which were sort of post-industrial, so those like Phoenix and Atlanta, and we'll look at those in a second. So, this is kind of telling. So here's some more graphs of sort of just what happened. First you see, New York experienced the same thing that did Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and other cities experienced, except they have recovered better. And we'll have to look in to see what they did differently. So how is New York different? I mean, it's different from all other cities in the country, pretty much. It is the urban area, right? It is the sort of quintessential urban place. But they still experienced the same thing that other cities experienced. They were not immune. And we might think that they experienced the precursor to the recovery after the decline in the 70s and 80s. And we'll talk about that in a second. So what we see here, though, you can see Detroit. So Detroit is the sort of dark blue, which has this sort of characteristic decline, and they were just totally devastated by not only the decline in manufacturing and in the auto industry especially, but in the decline of cities. So they have now have broad swaths of land that are unoccupied. Their population has, declined from nearly 2 million to, being just, a medium-sized city. And that's quite amazing, the amount of their decline. And what's also important, though, to look at is, this wasn't just a movement from the Detroit area to other areas, which could be explained by the collapse of the auto industry or something, and other manufacturing. Because if you look at the Detroit metro area in red, you see that it's sort of stabilized at a certain level. Very, very large population still. And so, it really is the urban part, the center city, which has declined, not these other areas in many of these cities. And, you can see this in the case of, well, where have people, flocked to in this post-industrial city period? Well, here's a few cities. One is Atlanta, and you can see in purple Atlanta, the central city of Atlanta, has been, just pretty stable, and has not seen dramatic decreases. Whereas the Atlanta metro has just taken off. The metro area has, and this is sort of what you read about, people moving to the Sun Belt. This is exactly what they're talking about. The metropolitan area of Atlanta has just, population has taken off in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and continues to. I mean, there's, if you look at it, there's no, end in sight, essentially. As well as Phoenix. Phoenix, this is for Phoenix, the city, which is a suburban city, has, really didn't take off until, the 1950s, and then, it's seen, it's the orange one, it has seen increases ever since. So this might, give you sort of the idea of what I'm trying to get, is that, center cities are what has declined, not these metropolitan areas. So there's been, a popular idea that cities are rising again. This is sort of what I wrote this in the syllabus. This might be why people might think that we should be concerned with, urban things, urban environments. And, we'll talk about this more later, but let's just, sort of think about why might we think this? Well, conditions have certainly improved. So, New York is extremely vibrant. They've recovered from, the population losses they received in, after the 50s. And DC as well. So DC has finally bottomed out. Their population has bottomed out, and their population is now increasing. And, it's become a very wealthy place. Crime has dramatically decreased. The murder rate has fallen dramatically. In the late I think actually 92 or 91, they had almost more than 400 murders in DC, just in the District of Columbia, and that has fallen to just over 100. And so, so you might think that is, reason for optimism. Things are improving. And if you go to DC, many of the neighborhoods, like Columbia Heights or, Adams Morgan, it's extremely vibrant, in the U Street area. And it seems like there's just tons of money flooding into the center city. But this has not been seen everywhere. Baltimore has not recovered, so they still have double the murders of DC. As an indication of crime, population continues to fall, and if you just go to Baltimore, you can tell it's not the same thing as DC. You do not see the just walking around as much development, although there is some. And so you might worry that, well, this might just be a localized thing. New York and DC are special in some obvious ways, and this might not be a general trend to overcome the suburban trend that we have seen. And what has this been so we need to think who's coming into the city, and it's different from who came into the industrial city in between 1850 and 1940. Predominantly young adults with no children. This is one large group. Retired people who don't want to drive. You know, so there's a lot of older baby boomers. They are coming in. You know, it's an upper class phenomenon, and you know, it's very different. So there's very few middle class people moving into the city, especially if they have children, because it's expensive to live in the city. Most people want to buy a house, and the schools are are pretty poor compared to the suburbs. And so these sorts of things, which cause people to move to the suburbs in the first place, are also causing them to move in. And what's very different is, you know, there's exceptions to this, but immigrants in, you know, post 1960 have been moving to the suburbs and not to the center city. And although there's, you know, many exceptions to this. So I mean, if you look at the, you know, the tremendous immigrant communities in the DC area, at least, they exist in, you know, just west of the University of Maryland along University Boulevard, University Boulevard, in just north of Tacoma Park area. Many Guatemalans live there. In Fairfax County, I mean, that you have tons of immigrant communities there. You know, Virginia, actually, Northern Virginia has, you know, some of the most immigrant communities, I think, in the country. And so you see, you know, many of the immigrants are not moving to the center city. They're, you know, they're settling in the suburbs. And this is totally different from what we experienced in the late 1800s and early 1900s, when immigrants were moving into the center city. And so, yes, the city might be rising again, but it's very different. You know, it's a very different process, and it's fueled more by people choosing the sort of lifestyle that's urban and not necessarily the economic benefits, because many jobs are still out in the suburbs. And so, yes, and we'll have to, you know, talk about this later, you know, it's certainly the case that cities are nicer now and people are choosing to move there, but still there are serious impediments to the city. So finally, you want to consider something we'll talk about later, and that's what we call new urbanism. So you might think that the industrial city is essentially dead, and what might be the urbanism of the future will not be like that. It'll be different in certain ways. It'll be more inspired by idealized urban environments, not by actual ones. And it'll put design, you know, centered. It'll be a mix of suburban and urban elements. It'll be more commercial, more affluent. And so that's exactly what new urbanism is. And you see there's certain developments. One is Celebration, Florida, which is, I mean, it's essentially a community it's a very controlled community, essentially, with certain businesses. It has a very rigid design. You know, the sort of design of your home is mandated by the rules, you know, certain community rules, and it's mixed use. It has certain elements from urban areas. It has certain elements from, in the sort of Jacobs view, the Jane Jacobs view, which we'll read part of her book later in the class. And so you might think this is what's really we should really pay attention to. And so, you know, the top two photos are from Celebration, Florida. The bottom right one's from a community which was designed by the same firm in near Madison, Wisconsin. And it sort of follows the same sort of design scheme. But, you know, if you research this, it might make you feel a little funny about these things. Like, it's unclear whether this is what we want. And, you know, the developments feel a little creepy. You know, you should visit one of these. It is a little creepy. It's unclear why. But, and also people still use their cars a lot. It's not like there's many people out walking around in some of these more residential areas because they mix suburban elements in. And so yeah, you know, we need to think about whether new urbanism is really all it's cracked up to be, because some people take it very seriously and think this is what we should be doing. But it seems slightly different from the more traditional urban areas in, say DC or Baltimore. Finally, what we need to think about is, is there a normative aspect to this? So much of what we'll be discussing in class is whether the urban is better than its alternatives, and one of them is the suburban. There's many different types of questions we can ask about this. This will be just, a few of them, and it'll be sort of an introduction to what we might discuss later about, which one should we choose? Do we have certain obligations to choose one or the other? Is one better for us than the other? People make lots of these claims, and it's unclear if this is true. So one is if it's is one actually better? One possibility, and this comes from the Brouwer article, or part of his book. Do people just have different tastes? So you might think that some people like cities, urban areas. Some people like suburban areas, and to each their own. As it turns out, it seems most people like suburban areas, and so that's what we're going to build more of. But yeah, sure, urban areas are fine. Some people like their vibrancy, that there's always drama and and action, so to speak. There's many choices you can make. Some people like that. Some people don't like it. And so, yeah, you can play this sort of moralistic game with this saying, oh, you're a bad person for living in the suburbs, but it becomes kind of ridiculous because it's like saying you're a bad person for liking chocolate over caramel. So that's sort of like the middle ground, and you might just be attracted to that view because then we don't have to play this moralistic game. But we might think that one is better than the other. And some have advanced, this has become a very popular argument, that urban areas are more sustainable. In this sort of sense we've become accustomed to nowadays. That in suburban areas you're using lots of petroleum, lots of land, all these sorts of resources using lots of, and urban areas are healthier, better for the environment, use less energy. So that might be true, especially if you don't use cars, but it needn't be true. You can have urban areas that are extremely wasteful. And actually, at certain levels of density, urban areas become more wasteful than suburban areas because it's with towers and such, it becomes, with skyscrapers, they become very dependent upon energy, lots of it. And so you might worry that this is not true, that it's not true that urban areas are more sustainable. So another question is whether urban areas allow for more social justice, especially equality. So you might think that a suburban area allows people to be away from others that might be less wealthy than them, and thus they might have to keep all their resources themselves. So urban areas sort of force rich people to be with poor people, to be with middle class people, right? So people are sort of forced together. Suburban areas allow people to segregate themselves based upon, in the past it's been race, but now it's especially based upon income level. So what some suburban areas do is they restrict who can live there by mandating that property values be a certain level. This is much harder to do in urban areas. Things are just closer together, and there's more mixing of different classes. And so you might think that suburbs sort of funnel money away from helping the social justice issue in the city. So you also might think that urban areas promote pro-social behavior, but sometimes you might think they don't, right? So people in urban areas you might think are colder towards others, and suburban areas they might be more friendly, but that's up for debate. So that's a rather complex one, and we'll discuss that later in another lecture. So finally, it seems clear that some suburbs are isolating. So sometimes people who live in suburbs don't know their neighbors, and so the argument goes, well, if you have more urbanness, people are forced to interact with each other, they come in contact with each other more, and they thus have improved community connections. And there's a few things to wonder about here. I mean, this is not necessarily the case in urban areas. So there's many urban areas where you do not know many people. Urban areas do not necessarily bring about sort of small town sort of community connections, and so that's a problem. In fact, they seem to sometimes cause people not to know their neighbors, to treat people as anonymously, as anonymous people they don't know. And also, it's not clear that close-knit communities are necessarily always good. Certainly it's not an intrinsic good, I don't think, unless you think it is, but you'd have to argue for that. And if it's an instrumental good, so it brings about a better life, however you define that, it's not necessarily going to do that. Some close-knit communities are quite terrible to live in because everything you do is known by everyone, and sometimes you just want to be left alone. And so this is what a lot of people like about cities, is that a lot of people don't know you. And so if we think that urbanness just brings about more community connections, it's good to a certain point probably, but some people don't like that and they don't want that. And so it seems like we shouldn't base our decisions on that. So I mention these here just because we should remember that these are distinct issues, right? So all these questions are distinct issues that we need to answer at some point, but we need to keep them separate. We shouldn't conflate them together. We shouldn't force them together, and we should answer them by themselves. Okay, so I hope this was both informative and not too boring. So next week we're going to really get into the meat of the course. So this week was mostly just historical issues. I wanted to get you sort of a context in which we're working. And next week we're going to start answering questions about how a city should be like. So we're going to look at certain idealized versions of cities, certain theorists, especially in 1930s, 1940s. People were really thinking about how we can improve the city. And we're sort of think about what that should be like. What should a city be like? What sort of criteria we should use? And then what we're going to do as well is talk about, so what pressures do cities face? So for instance, just as sort of a preview, cities can't raise their taxes extremely high in order to pay for lots of great things, because what can happen is people can leave the city. So what cities are sometimes forced to do is to keep their taxes low enough to keep people in the city. And one problem with metropolitan areas is that it's very easy to live in a suburb and then commute into the city. So you're using the city for a lot of things, but you don't need to pay taxes. And this is going to be a problem. So cities are under these taxation problems. So they need a tax base to pay for things, but it's very easy for people to leave. There's a low barrier to leaving the city, relative to leaving like a country or something. And so it's really hard for cities to raise lots of money. And so that's just one example. We'll talk about many others. Okay, so that's for next week. So I'll try to have some, if not most of the readings up today, and then others will be up Monday definitely, and lectures will be up Monday or Tuesday. And so what I want you to do for next week, so next week we're going to start using the forum, and you need to, as I said in my intro video, you need to post about 100 or 300 word little question or view about stuff I've talked about in lecture or reading. And it should be substantive, so it should show that you understand the topics and are questioning them further. So you want to do that, and then everyone needs to respond to at least one person's question, and make sure that everyone's had at least one response to theirs, right? And then what hopefully happens is we start to have some more detailed discussions about these things, and these things get interesting. That's the hope, at least. Okay, So do that by Thursday. So I want that up on the forum, on Thursday, and then we can, Friday we'll have more conversations about that, discussions about that. I'll send out any announcements. I won't be emailing all announcements from now on. I'll send out an announcement about me not emailing announcements. So you should be checking the Elms website. And, let me know if you have any questions, and feel free to post questions about this video to the comments. I'll see you next week.